Now I have put forward a compelling case as to why the view that nanotechnology may well pose significant risks to the future survival of our species is an Now I have put forward a compelling case as to why the view that nanotechnology may well pose significant risks to the future survival of our species is an eminently sensible and defensible one. I wish to discuss another man-made threat, namely man-made viruses. If a lethal, contagious, and airborne man-made virus was ever unleashed upon the world, could you even begin to imagine the panic and pandemonium that might result? Well, there are strong reasons indeed to fear such an outcome in the not too distant future. Not only do virologists already know the genes that are responsible for enabling viruses to become airborne, but killer viruses that currently have no known cure, such as HIV/AIDS, are quite simple in their structure, meaning that they would be quite easy to make in the laboratory. Not only that, but in the early 21st century, the cavalier attitude with which governments persist in allowing the genome of killer viruses, such as the Spanish flu, to be published on the internet, which incidentally killed about 2% of the world's population back in 1918, is worrying indeed. If these forms of technology ever became relatively cheap and widely available, as for example laptops and mobile phones have become in recent years, then mankind could be in a whole world of trouble. Literally. Indeed, the claim made by Michio Kaku that high school students will soon have the capacity of manipulating life forms in their biology classes, if true, could have truly frightening and terrifying consequences. In Wikipedia's article, a viral pandemic is briefly discussed as one of the 7 greatest threats to mankind, but the epidemiologist that the author talks to seems unable to process the fact that killer viruses may be unleashed upon the world intentionally by a conscious agent, as evidenced by the following quote, which assures Wikipedia's author that a doomsday scenario by way of a viral pandemic is most assuredly not on the cards. That's not what the virus is out to accomplish, explains Ali S. Khan from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, because that would mean killing itself. By ignoring the threat of a bioterrorist organization utilizing the new technologies that may become widely available in the near future, and by ignoring the threat of an exceptionally gifted individual or group of individuals consciously designing a killer virus that cares not if it dies together with its host, a perfectly plausible existential risk humanity faces in the near future is relegated to little more than a minor inconvenience. But a pandemic would stifle human interaction and with it the economy for months. This is yet another example of how the author systematically undermines the biggest existential threats that face our species, if indeed he addresses them at all, and it is an all too common response to any serious talk of humanity going the way of the dodo. At least when discussing the possibility of a nuclear world war, the author actually manages to acknowledge that mankind's tenure on this planet could potentially be curtailed by mankind's actions, the only time, however, that he does so in the entire piece. Global nuclear war is the only apocalyptic catastrophe that is totally man-made, he reassuringly informs the reader, as if 21st, 22nd and 23rd century technologies are unlikely to equal or surpass the destructive powers of technologies originating in the middle of the 20th century. The article discloses that according to experts, 1,000 nuclear bombs would be enough to seriously endanger the survival of the human race. Given that there are currently 19,000 nuclear bombs distributed around the world, according to the Federation of American Societies, it is felt that there are more than enough nuclear bombs to make even the most life-affirming optimists out there question the wisdom of perpetuating our species if a significant number of them were ever to be used in the heat of battle. It is instructive to reflect on how nuclear bombs kill. When nuclear bombs are dropped on a city, then large numbers of people are instantly vaporized. Then there are many more that die of radiation, if they are unfortunate enough to be situated close enough to the blast. The number of fatalities could be ratcheted up significantly higher if millions of tons of soot caused by sustained nuclear bomb attacks billow into the atmosphere and block out the sunlight for years, resulting in a nuclear winter. If this were to happen, crop failure would occur, resulting in starvation for millions or billions of people. A grim prospect indeed. When we consider the number of current hotspots in the world, including Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea, it is not difficult to see why, at the Global Catastrophic Risk Conference, a verdict was made that there is a 1% chance that all of humanity will be wiped out by nuclear war by 2100 AD, and a 10% chance that at least 1 billion people will die. It is worth noting at this stage of my analysis that we are currently in a century that promises to hold a great deal of problems and civil unrest for humanity on a global scale. We have a global capitalist economic system that is in crisis, a constant dwindling away of natural resources, most notably fossil fuels in the form of gas and oil, a human population that is projected to reach as many as 9 or 10 billion by the year 2050 AD, and to top it off, the human race is still systematically degrading the environment, principally through the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, but in several other ways also, including water pollution. Global warming is also still very much a pressing issue for the human race, but the propensity people have to simply dismiss it as a ruse employed by governments in order to extract more money in the form of tax from its citizens is worrying, especially given the devastating effect global warming could have on the welfare of literally millions or perhaps even billions of people. Given the current zeitgeist, it seems likely that the number of hotspots in the world will significantly increase this century rather than decrease, as countries continue to vie with one another for control of rapidly diminishing resources, as the human population surges past the people carrying capacity of the planet, and as the increasingly strained economic system in place exerts more adverse effects on people's psychological well-being. It is not difficult at all to see how all this could contribute to a rise in fierce and hostile competition between nations. If human history has taught us anything, it is that the human race is an aggressive and opportunistic species that will attack itself if it deems that it is in its best interest to do so, or if it feels threatened or rattled. Steven Pinker may arguably have had a point when he argued in The Better Angels of Our Nature that violence has declined markedly since the end of the Second World War, an era he calls somewhat hyperbolically the Great Peace. But the whole notion of this current fragile and precarious stalemate between nations persisting indefinitely is more than faintly ridiculous, and as we examine the state of the world today, it looks for all the world that tempers will soon flare and that people will look back at the late 20th and early 21st century and think nostalgically about these relatively peaceful and innocent times. Despite all this, regretfully, I see the prospect of humanity completely wiping itself out in a nuclear war this century is minimal. Sadly, it is my belief that nuclear bombs are too crude a technology to even remotely assure the guaranteed obliteration of our entire species, let alone that of all sentient life. My biggest concern is that a nuclear world war could result in what Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom refers to as a crunch, an existential threat whereby the potential to develop into transhumanity is permanently thwarted, but human life still continues to persist in some form. I dislike the idea of transhumanism as it personally seems contrived and monstrous to me, but I think that the types of technologies that will be needed to wipe out humanity and/or all life on Earth in a guaranteed or near guaranteed way will necessarily coincide with the development of increasingly sophisticated technologies that would also almost certainly enable some forms of transhumanism to occur. However, I would argue that if humanity ever gets to the point where a high degree of mastery over nanotechnology and man-made viruses is obtained, then humanity is a goner, regardless of what forms of transhumanism may be obtained. Many would argue that the more sophisticated human technologies get, the better humanity will be placed to defend itself from self-imposed extinction. However, I would argue that there is something akin to an inherent asymmetry between technologies that are designed to kill or destroy on the one hand, and technologies that are designed to protect people from these threats on the other. I hold this view because I think the former type of technology is considerably easier to construct and operate than the former. For example, the unleashing of vast quantities of energy in the form of a nuclear bomb is easier to achieve than the creation of a suitable shield to protect oneself from the heat and radiation caused by such a device. A killer man-made virus is easier to create than a vaccine or immunity mechanism for said virus. And a grey goo catastrophe is easier to set in motion than any efforts that could be made in order to prevent it from occurring or otherwise stop it dead in its tracks. If I am right, which I am confident that I am, then it is eminently possible that the threat of a crunch notwithstanding, humanity is simply currently running on borrowed time before it inexorably and inevitably self-implodes, like a young man who goes drink driving every night and one evening pays the ultimate price. Oh, and by the way, Merry Christmas.